Hello, everyone. My name is Rick Ginsberg. I'm the Dean of the School of Education and Human Sciences here at the University of Kansas. I want to welcome you all to our school's annual summer conference for educators. We call it Strategies for Educational Improvement. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the fact that we are broadcasting this webinar from the University of Kansas, which occupies homelands of several tribes, including the Kaw, Kickapoo, Sioux, Osage, and Shawnese peoples. We honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land. The school recognizes and supports the sovereignty of all indigenous people and communities, including the 4 federally funded tribes of Kansas, the Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation, the Kickapoo tribe in Kansas, the Sax-and-Fox nations of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska, and the Iowa tribes of Kansas and Nebraska, as well as members of the Delaware, Paw, and Wyandot nations. We also value the indigenous ways of knowing and learning. This acknowledgement compels us to continue advocating for, supporting, and hiring indigenous students and staff, while also amplifying the voices of our Native American students and colleagues. We are pleased that we are able to offer this conference virtually again this year. Perhaps next year we'll be back face-to-face. And we're able to offer this for free to educators across the region. The conference this year is sponsored by the School of Education and Human Sciences, the Kansas State Department of Education, and the Kansas Alliance for the Arts in Education. The conference is hosted by the Global Education Academy. Global Education Academy is a unit of the School of Education and Human Sciences. It works with leading theorists, innovators, practitioners around the world to offer educators online professional development with options for earning micro-learning credentials that are stackable and can be stacked towards graduate credit. More information is available at global-academy@ku.edu. Again, global-academy@ku.edu. Our theme for this year, as I mentioned, Strategy for Educational Improvement, the theme is Back to the Future, Time to Redesign. As we're prepared to re-enter our buildings with our students in the fall, what should we be thinking about? What have we learned through this past year that might help us create a new normal that offers better experiences for both students and teachers? Our focus today is the 4th and final of our sessions that we've offered. The focus today is on countering disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech in the classroom. We've invited 4 outstanding speakers and experts to share their different perspectives on these issues. We ask you to place any questions in the Q&A function on the bottom of the Zoom page, and the questions will all be answered at the end of the session. Again, don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A area if you will. By way of introduction, this topic of misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech has been something I've been thinking about for a long time. It's a timely topic. In a 2018 report, the Rand Corporation referred to the current period as a time of what they called truth decay. And they said truth decay is characterized by 4 trends: increasing disagreement about facts, a blurring of the line between opinion and fact, the increasing relative volume and resulting influence of opinion over fact, and declining trust in what were formerly respected sources of fact. Hillary Clinton, in a recent interview in The Guardian, called for, and I quote her here, a global reckoning with disinformation that includes reining in the power of big technology. Frank Bruni, the great columnist for the New York Times, who actually is leaving the newspaper world and becoming, of all things, an academic, lamented in his last column, and I quote him here, that I and other journalists, opinion writers especially, have contributed to the dynamics that we decry: the toxic tenure of American discourse, the furious pitch of American politics, the volume and vitriol of it all. Misinformation, falsehoods, outright lies, and hatred seem to be winning the day in America these days. and our teachers and educators are going to have to deal with that. The nastiness of our politics, the murder of George Floyd, those events that preceded and followed it have raised the level of unsavory behavior to a feverish pitch. In social media today, people can easily find an outlet for their beliefs, and few, very few, are capable of discerning truth from fiction. Psychologists refer to what they call, and I quote, motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning is when individuals think through a topic with the aim of reaching a particular conclusion. I think many of our news outlets are driven by that very process. Just to underscore the challenge for our speakers and all of you in the field, a 2018 study analyzed 126,000 stories spread by 3 million people on Twitter more than 4.5 million times. And here's what they found. Falsehoods were 70% more likely to be retweeted than was truth. Falsehoods 70% more likely than truth. Outside of school and homework, teenagers spend more than 7 hours a day online. That's what Jessica and the other educators are having to deal with. 3/4 of teenagers say that they get their news from social media often or sometimes, and nearly 70% get their media through internet videos. That's scary to me. Alarmingly, a study was released earlier by Stanford University this very week. Researchers found that high school students were incapable of going online and determining if the stories they were reading were accurate. It involved over 3,500 students who worked on the internet mightily with multiple tasks that they were given, stories off the internet. Here's just a couple of examples. More than half of the students believed an anonymously posted Facebook video about voter fraud in the US provided solid evidence of voter fraud in the American Democratic primaries, when in fact, the video was shot in Russia and was a story about fraud in the Soviet Union, not in America. Indeed, less than 0.1% of the high school students involved in the study were able to determine the true source of the video. On another task, a website claiming to disseminate, quote, factual reports, end quote, about climate change was provided to the students, and 96% of them failed to discover that the publisher was the fossil fuel industry. Students in all cases were too easily swayed by websites, relatively weak indicators of credibility. What were those things? How it looked, the characteristics of its domain name, the site's about, whatever the site was about, its page and what they said about themselves, or just the quantity of information. None of that has to do with truth necessarily. The study's authors, while not criticizing the students, suggested that the findings should be troubling to anyone who cares about the future of democracy. Students, they argued, need to be trained to be better consumers of information. I would add to that, so do teachers in the K-12 space and faculty in higher education. So that is what we as educators and parents face in the current atmosphere. That's what we as citizens face. Approaches like lateral reading, perhaps someday we can talk about that, does offer some hope. But the reality is that few teachers and school leaders are skilled in ways to help ourselves and certainly not to help our students. This session is prepared to try to address this urgent matter. Our first speaker is Dr. D.A. Graham. D.A. is the Interim Vice Provost of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the University of Kansas. Dr. Graham is the former Vice President of Global Integrity Leader at Nielsen in New York. He worked as the University Ombudsman at the University of Kansas, at Princeton, and at San Diego State University. He's the former Director of Human Relations at the University of Sciences in Philadelphia. Dr. Graham has more than 20 years of experience as a master facilitator and mediator in the resolution of complaints, appeals, and internal grievance processes for employer and employee relationships. He's the founder of the Intergroup Dialogue Coalition, a group that helps foster deep conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and strategies. Dr. Graham has served his country with distinction as an active duty Navy chaplain, and prior to that, hospital corpsman in the U.S. Navy Reserves. My friend D.A. Graham. D.A.?
Rick, thank you so much for that. And it is an absolute pleasure to be here with you and this great panel. And I'm looking forward to the dialogue that will happen today. I wanted to talk today about some tips. I always love it when I can go to a conference and I can walk away with some tools, some things that will help me. And so what I will say is, if anyone would like a copy of any of the slides or anything that, actually I only have one slide, that we will use, we will definitely make that available. So misinformation, disinformation, hate speech. We've seen a lot over the years. I know in my entire lifetime, growing up in the state of Alabama, where the governor stood in the door a few years before I was born, and said that no Negroes will attend this university. And when I heard that or heard about that, it was the only university I applied to. At the University of Alabama, I founded an organization, the Alabama Student Society of Communication Arts, because I wanted students to have a way to voice their concerns around issues that they were experiencing in spaces where they did not feel that they had voice. That group that we founded back in 19 is now the ambassadors for the College of Communications at the University of Alabama. I was also a part of the group that rallied students together to elect the first Black homecoming queen in the history of the state of Alabama at the University of Alabama in 1993. I was in graduate school at the time. So it was a wonderful introduction for me in how to deal with misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. Or when you go into your dorm room and someone has written the N-word on your door, and it is alarming. It's absolutely alarming, and other negative things. So today I realize we're talking to K through 12 folks, but I wanted to give you a little background of where I came from and why this is so important to me. So one of the first things, what I want to talk to you about today is tips for facilitating challenging and difficult conversations or dialogues. And the first thing we want to do is really, what is it that is happening within me, right? The first thing I need to do is to check myself. I entitled this Facilitator Considerations, right? So if you're going to facilitate a dialogue with students, so the question is, am I equipped to facilitate a dialogue on X, Y, and or Z, right? So let's say it's a dialogue about race, or it's a dialogue around gender, sexual orientation, or any of the identities that are out there that it can cause hurt or pain. So one of the things that I ask is, what are my own biases, right? That's one of the first things we want to think about. The other part of that is, am I able to separate managing, right, the process from the content? And there's a difference, right? There's a difference between managing the process, because sometimes the content gets in the way, or even sometimes the process gets in the way of the content. And sometimes I will ask folks to just take a time out and let's talk about the process. Let's talk about what's happening in this space right now, rather than just trying to keep going because we want to get to the content. And so it's important that we then ask ourselves, what assumptions am I making about this particular identity or information that we're talking about? Okay, so am I equipped to facilitate a dialogue on a particular topic that has come up in the classroom or in the national media or maybe state or local situations, right? What are my biases? Am I able to separate managing the process from the content? And then what assumptions am I making about this particular information? The next thing we want to do is to check in with ourself, right? Check in with self, right? So identify distorted thinking patterns that I have, right? So things around absolute thinking, right? Overgeneralizations, right? Mental filters, jumping to conclusions. I like this other one, magnification or minimization, right? Emotional reasoning is another one. And then finally, labeling and blaming, right? So am I coming from a place of alienation and disconnection myself? Am I showing up in judgment, evaluations, and so those are things I need to check. I need to check myself. Then the third thing is practicing empathy. Do I have the capacity to place myself in that person who disagrees with me shoes, or the person who brought up this issue and they've said something that has caused a reaction in the classroom? So can I show up from a place of understanding and connection, right? Rather than holding this person in wrongness or badness, right? And recognizing that it just may be that this person really doesn't understand what they've said or why they said it because of their own histrionics, their own biases, their own worldview, socialization, and enculturations that they've had in their own lives. The fifth one, the fourth is to expect that everyone may be at a different level of experience and what? Impact, right? Everyone's not going to be at the same level. Everyone doesn't see the issue from the same place that you see it from. So expect that everyone may be at a different level of experience and impact in that setting. So you want to be able to ask the group during the session, right? We need to do a group check-in. Let's check in. And I'm going to talk more about that in a few minutes. So so number 5 is when a statement is made that creates a visceral reaction, what should you do? The first thing I say is pause, accept silence, be okay with silence, just pause. And so I have an acronym I like to use, and it's called PASS, P-A-S-S. So that it starts with pause, right? So in the pause, you're gonna breathe, right? In through your nose, out through your mouth. I used to tell my daughter, you wanna smell the soup, cool the soup, right? So you wanna pause, breathe. Then you want to anchor yourself. So this is a grounding technique, right? So you find something or some way to connect to something that could ground you, whether that's the chair you're sitting in, right? Push yourself a little deeper into that chair, or your feet further into the floor, right? If you're holding someone's hand, right? Just connect to something else. Then you want to shift your thinking, right? So you pause, anchor, shift. Shift your thinking from wrongness and badness to empathy and compassion, right? So pause, anchor, shift, and then speak. Or you can allow for the silence. And And one other technique you can do is to ask other members of the group to react to that visceral statement that has been made. Number 6, right? If a statement is made, ask a divergent question, right? So seek clarity. Now, how do we do that? So here's some examples, right? Tell me more about X, Y, and or Z. Or can you expand on X, Y, and or Z, right? That topic. And then finally, let the group ask each other questions. Prompt the group to ask questions, okay? So tell me more about it. Can you expand on it? And let the group ask each other questions. Number 7, right? Make behavioral observations and check in with the group. Let the group drive the process, okay? So make behavioral observations, check in with the group, and let the group drive the observations. So a lot of times when we have these difficult conversations, we're so invested in it ourselves, right? Because of our own identities that we are presenting in this space. So we want to be able to ask ourselves, am I observing or am I judging, right? Am I observing, right? Or am I judging? And then finally, how would the group like to address what has come up, right? That's a way you can engage and have the students in that space articulate some ideas and strategies for engaging what has been brought up or the topic that has been brought up, especially if it's a hot topic. Number 8, right? You want to acknowledge individual experiences, right? And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that lived experience is greater than any opinion, okay? Lived experience is greater than any opinion. And so we want to make sure that we acknowledge the individual experience, sharing by recognizing the courage to share, the vulnerability to share, the level of emotions, and being authentic in doing so. Number 9, right? Emotional safety is so important. Psychological safety is so important. If there is an emotional breakdown, don't stop it, right? Let them work through that. Just pause and let them work through that. The other thing is, I would also recommend having the counselor or on call, right? That you're going to have these kinds of conversations, and you want to make sure that they are aware, if there's a school counselor or something to that effect, that students are aware that they are able to go and have a one-on-one session with those folks. So don't stop the emotional breakdown. Support the person who is in that space. You want to acknowledge it, respectfully ask the group or the individual if time should be extended to be able to support their colleague who is having this emotional breakdown. Number 10, your role is to facilitate the process. It may be difficult to also engage and take part in the content and sharing. So I just want you to be able to acknowledge that, right? So your role is to control the process. And then you need to be okay with the fact that you may not be able to partake at the level that you would like. And as a facilitator, the group drives the process, right? You pose the questions to the group and you allow the group to drive the process. but you're there to create this healthy, safe, structured environment for them to operate in. And then finally, allow adequate time for the group to share and consider the group size and time, right? So you want to make sure that you deduct 10 to 15 minutes at the end to check in. You want to find out what were some of the learnings from the session. And then also you want to talk about what's next steps, right? What are some next steps that we should look at? So that's for the facilitator. Now, when you facilitating the group time, right? So one is create a safe space, which you heard me talk about earlier, for sharing and honoring that space, right? So create a safe space. And that one of the ways we do that is that we define common goals, common intentions, right? And so this sets the tone for the conversation. You want to be able to set up the conversation agreements. I don't set up rules because rules are made to be broken, right? So we want to set up agreements. This is what we agreed to. So what are the conversation agreements and how the group will interact and engage each other? So these are the things that we believe in and we will hold each other accountable for. Set up the time constraints, inform the group that you will give them a 15-minute reminder before the ending, and you heard me talk about that earlier. Just make sure you're checking in with the group at times, right? So give yourself an opportunity to do check-ins, and I'm going to talk more about that here in a few minutes. Open the conversation or the dialogue with an open-ended question, okay? We are here to discuss. You can start and say, and then you want to insert what the common goals and intentions are, right? Who would like to start?
DA, we're going to have you wrap up.
All right, I'm almost there. So we want to close the meeting with the group, like I said, allow for 15 minutes. And then the way that we do that is we ask for some takeaways for the group. So Rick, I probably went over my time, so thank you. I get all excited about this stuff.
Yeah, great start. And he does a lot of that work for us on campus, and we're lucky to have him here. Our second speaker is Dr. Professor Xiangming Duan. Xiangming is a professor in our Department of Educational Psychology in the area of counseling psychology. She received her PhD in social and counseling psychology from the University of Maryland. Prior to joining KU's faculty in 2011, she had been a faculty member at the University of Missouri Columbia and also at the University of Missouri Kansas City. Her professional interests include researching counseling processes and outcomes in cultural contexts and topics related to multicultural education and counseling the culturally diverse. She is also interested in doing international work in counseling-related training and research. Xiangming is committed to cross-cultural understanding and pursuing multicultural perspectives to enhance the science and practice of counseling psychology. She is a valued colleague in the school. Xiangming, mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Rick. I was thinking this presentation, I'm speaking in front of so many experts because all the audience are all education experts, so it's difficult. Now, after Dr. Graham's talk, it's making it even more difficult. It's a big shoes to fill. Actually, I share a lot of what he said. So I will reflect it from different degrees in my sharing. When I was contacted about this conversation, this panel, and I was thinking, how would I was asked how I would label my, or title my sharing. And I thought about it. I used the title, I don't know if everyone agrees, I said it's always educating, protecting, and helping our students, even in the face of hate speech. So I was trying to see if I can share with you my thinking on this topic from a psychological perspective. As Rick introduces, I'm a psychologist, so I feel I'm an outsider. Everyone else is here is an expert in education. So I will share my personal and psychological perspective on how do we deal with, what we are facing right now in our classrooms and our school communities. But before I share, I wanted to say, I really wanted to say, and I don't know how to say how honored I feel I can speak in front of a group of K through 12 teachers. And I really need to salute to you all. Because in myself, in my mind, K through 12 teachers, my teachers, they are the ones who get me where I am now. In China, I came from China about 4 decades ago, and we call teachers spiritual engineers. I do believe, so you are doing the most important work. So my salute to you, and I also feel very appreciative you're tuning today. That really shows that you care, and you want to bring your students with you on this journey towards addressing what challenges from political, culture, societal aspects coming into our communities. So thank you. You're doing the very important work. Teaching is a noble profession. That's why I think I talk to you. I feel like now Chinese saying is that show myself up in front of an expert. So please forgive me if I say things that don't fit. But what I'm going to share is really from some of my personal thinkings that's based on the psychological sciences. The first, I have some assumptions. For this discussion, I have assumptions. One is that all I shared, my thoughts, is surrounded working with a school community that's a K through 12. That means that all our learners are youngsters, are kids or young adults, adolescents. So they're young. And in my mind, so this different conversation with them or with our college students or my doctoral students may be different. So this is a education. When we talk about education, we really need to think about who are our targets, our learners. The second assumption I make is that to different degrees, all of you sitting here probably agree with me to some extent, to a certain extent, is about the goals I have set, because the goals is going to be very important for all my thinking. Is I label it as educating, protecting, helping, and it could be other goals, but it could be something related. I assume my assumptions, you agree with me, at least some of this, because all students deserve our support, our effort to educate, protect, and help. Another assumption is that what we are striving towards is really figuring out how, HOW. Perhaps this is my professional career get to this point. All my thinking, every topic comes up, I will think, I do a lot of psychotherapy training, and in my mind, it's not what, is how. How do we arrive the places we want to arrive? How do we gain or achieve the things we want to achieve? So that's also is going to shape my sharing, my angle. So having said that, then let's face it, right now, our bigger context, I don't need to tell you, you all feel that there are certain sources of challenges we didn't have as much as now, right? Before the internet, we didn't have this many misinformation, disinformation, or hate speeches, or violence, etc. Right? The internet, in some ways, it did a lot of good things, but also in this regard, sometimes it helped distribute, like Rick shared some of those as shocking statistics about people believing those misinformation. So that's the biggest unstable factor we have to face. During this time, I think people tend to sometimes feel challenged or feel frustrated or feel out of control, etc. But what I want to remind all of us as educators It's always the focus of believe that even if there are so many unstable factors right there, and there are still stable factors, those will not change. Simply our students, their learning needs, their psychological needs, that's not changed. Their students, our education, the goal of education. And the second is we as educators. I think we are the stable factors. So why we're in education? Why do we choose in education? So I mentioned that in my mind, teaching is such a noble profession, particularly in K through 12. You know, it doesn't pay you tons of money. With your intelligence, you can find a lot of other more high-paying jobs, but you choose education for a purpose, for a reason. So that's, I think, that's a stable factor. It's not going to change. So what we can contribute to students' education learning, that's probably something is on every one of us, our mind. So that I think what is important when we deal with this challenging situation is that, one, we know our limitations. We know, you know, sometimes what we wish we could do, but we can't. So we know that's our limitation. And I personally think about it. Personally, it took me a long time to be really realistic about my limitations. I often think, yeah, I know my limitations, but in fact, I don't. When I act as if I know everything, I just go with my agenda. I may forget my learners, I may forget about the outcome. So if I know my limitation, there's certain things beyond my control. I will not waste my energy on that. You know, there are certain things I cannot change without school situation that student bring in. There's things beyond the school that I don't have direct control over there. So I will not waste my time. Instead, I focus on what I can do. Now, speaking of what I can do, so what I wanted to say is personally, when I do education, do counseling training, I always want to remind myself to be goal-oriented. We know where we want to go, what we want to achieve. This is easy to say, but very hard. There are times people, I ask this question to every doctor students who are, you know, so advanced in doing psychotherapy. I say, what is your ultimate goal? They've fumbled on it, don't know how to say about that particular kind of situation because didn't give enough thought. So I do want us to be very clear where do we want to go? What is the end goal we want to achieve? The second is context sensitive. The context matters. Don't judge people out of the context. So the context is changing our society, so we need to understand it. The third one is really focusing on strengths and resources. It's something we can use rather than something we cannot change. So that help us to how to get to where we want to be more effective. Now, this is also, my thinking is this also summarizes from my learning of psychological theories. I want to list a couple of them you're all familiar with, so that we know when we work with the students in the classroom, in the school community, we can utilize them. One is reinforcement theory. Every one of us probably had learned in high school or college at reinforcement theory. So we need to know what and what not to reinforce. There are times we chase after one wrong saying or one behavior. We forgot about it. At the meantime, we're reinforcing that behavior as well. So need to be clear, you know, what do we want to reinforce in the classroom and what we don't. So use that theory smartly. It's very, very useful, very helpful. The second is motivation theory. You know, you all are very familiar with the motivation. In my own learning from my school, from elementary, high school, the teachers I love the most and most helpful are those who make me feel motivated, wanting to learn. So we all know this motivation theory. We need to help the students cultivate motivation that includes their sense of efficacy, autonomy, and the relationship. And the third one is a change theory from a positive psychological perspective. What leads to change? We all wanted changes. We all students are changing. We want particularly those students who say wrong things, do wrong things. We want them to change. But we need to think about what leads to change. Now, positive psychology gives us some hint, which sometimes we don't pay enough attention. We say, even if when the situation is really terrible, the individuals has to be the one who wants to change, can change, right? So how do we help them to be wanting to change? That has a lot to do with their feelings. So there's some little bit of positive emotions, little bit of positive feelings about themselves can go a long way to help them to wanting to change. So those theories are also very helpful. And also, I want to use the Sir Ken Robinson's analogy is an agricultural educational approach. No matter what hard issues we're dealing with students, always remember we're working with organic bodies and minds. We're not mechanics. We're not dealing with the machines. So we have to think about if I don't want to be a technician. I want to be a nurturing farmer. So provide the conditions good for students to learn, to grow. So that is applied to same to people who may be the victims of violence or maybe the perpetrators, so to speak. So those are the psychological insight that helped me to see that. Now, what we do, so I can, I think my time is almost up. I want to be quick. Is what do we do? This is what I remind myself from doing from a psychological perspective. It is whenever we work with the student situations, issues, we always focus on the student. We often forget, particularly when someone makes a statement that causes the visceral reactions like Dr. Graham gives, that is going to drain a lot of attention. So as a teacher in around, how do we turn attention to the person? As educators, if we want to protect, we'll protect the person, right? Even those who may say the hate speeches, may students mimic or learn from somewhere, they may repeat that in the classroom inappropriate, but we do not want the content to take us away and do not want to divert our attention from the students. The students may have psychological needs that give us room for us to get in to do something positive. Okay, that remind me an example. One person was robbing a bank. The bank cashier, the person said, had a gun, said, give me $2,000, otherwise I'll blow everything up. So this person knows that $2,000 immediately show curiosity. You tell me about your why do you ask for $2,000? So this person say, because a family member was in jail, needed $2,000. So that, oh, I can talk to you, get you $2,000 through a loan. So that's a simple example to really share that how do we focusing on the person that help us to get around with a difficult situation. The second is to focus on what we can do. There are things when we get frustrated, when we don't know what to do, that usually we get pulled by the certain things being said, certain behavior being exhibited. But if we can just turn around to say, focus on what we want to achieve, then we can say what we can do. Even if we cannot get rid of this misinformation, but we can help to promote accurate information. Even if we cannot change the students, the things that he believes he said that, but we can focus our understanding on understanding the psychological needs. The student maybe wanted to get attention, maybe wanted to show people I have an efficacy, I have ideas, so that we can find the things we can do. So from a psychological perspective. We can also help making the students who feel wronged, be victimized, and to feel heard and respected. This is important. I cannot overemphasize appreciation, respect, and trust, how valuable, important psychological speaking for us to exercise. Now, finally, I want to emphasize, we want to achieve exactly, we want to know exactly what we want to achieve. I would say, we want to, instead of focusing too much on correct the wrong, maybe it's better to focus on what we achieve is going to be achieved the right. So basically, from avoidance language to go towards approaching language, knowing what we want to achieve, that opens a lot more doors, a lot more room for we do what we can to help students or help the community to heal, to recover, or to whatever the needs are. So in some, use our expertise to identify what we want to achieve. I use the big words, educating, protecting, and helping. I'm sure you can identify specific elements in every one of those concepts. That's how we eventually reach EDI, right? So use our understanding to position ourselves and use our best skills to achieve exactly what we want to. So that is educate, protect, and help all students, including those who do the wrong or who suffered from the wrong. So if we have this mindset, we probably can see more opportunities, more space, more room for us to exercise what we're good at. Do what we're good at. Each one of you have your unique set of skills and expertise, as long as you use them well. And you cannot mimic one set of skills, but your skills matters. Use that to the best you can. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiangming. A lot of great advice there and a lot for us to think about. I want to remind all of the participants out in the audience that you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them when we're done. Pleased to introduce our third speaker. It's Dr. Shelley Klein. Shelley is an historian and the Director of Education at the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education in Overland Park, Kansas City. She received her PhD from KU. Her research focuses on the SS Afsherin, how did I do? In the concentration camp system and the gendered perpetration of the Holocaust. Her research has been supported by grants from the University of Kansas, University of and the University of Hamburg. She's presented at national and international conferences. She's been an instructor for KU in the humanities program and in their Jewish studies program. She also served on the faculties of the Kansas City Art Institute and the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Shelley, we're honored to have you here.
Thank you. I thought I would talk to everyone a little bit about some cases that we see in the Kansas City area and how we facilitate some instances of hate speech specifically surrounding the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And these are just a few cases from the last couple of years and perhaps then some things you might think about in your own experiences. One thing that comes up as a recurring theme, so I'll just give you a couple of cases and you'll see this yourself. One case we had were students engaging in out-of-school behavior where they played Nazi beer pong. And this brings up a question too about where's the school responsible when it's students outside versus on the actual school grounds. And yet because the students are affiliated, the school gets pulled into it. And so that was one case. Another case was a homecoming ask that involved a young man using the saying, go to homecoming with me. And frankly, I can't not see us going together. So a play on words involving Anne Frank and Nazis. Many of these things come up time and time again in cases where the students think that they're being funny, where in fact their behavior is bordering or completely in the territory of anti-Semitic territory. What's interesting is oftentimes we find there's not a lack of Holocaust education, but rather a lack of empathy on the part of these students. And so when we get called in to deal with these cases, one of the first things we do, of course, is ask about the type of education that these students have had access to. And oftentimes what we find is they've had robust education in terms of knowing about the Holocaust. And yet there's often an empathy piece that seems to be missing. And so one thing, we recommend, and I've heard it, even from our first two speakers here, is try and emphasize empathy. So we'll have people look at survivor experiences, making it more personal than just, times and dates and facts and things like that. Another thing that's happened, especially in the last year, are political comparisons to the Holocaust. And we've seen this both with students and also with teachers, comparing government mandates in our time to things of the Nazi government. And so important to communicate that there are things that are bad that are not the Holocaust, that any sort of government, if you call it overreach, is not fascism, but understanding that slippery slope, both on, teachers themselves understanding it, and then helping students decipher that for themselves. One thing that and there was just an article in the Washington Post about this a couple of days ago, is Holocaust education in this country is pretty pervasive. At the same time, what we find is it's also just enough to make people dangerous. So they have some facts, but they don't maybe have a deeper empathy. And so it becomes the point of comparison that anything bad that happens has to be the Holocaust. And of course, that's not useful. So one thing too that we urge, especially teachers, is to think about how we can usefully use the Holocaust in terms of comparison, that we never want to compare suffering. It's always inappropriate to compare one group's suffering to another. However, how can we use these historic examples to make a better future for ourselves? And one example that we've used quite a bit is looking at America's policy, immigration policy during the 1930s and 40s. How did that negatively impact the European Jewish population versus thinking about what do our own immigration policies do now? So again, not comparing suffering of people in the 30s and 40s to now, but thinking about similarities in terms of government policies as well. So we've done quite a few things in that regard. One thing that people most probably often expect is to hear about lots of cases of Holocaust denial. And I would say that is something that we mostly rarely deal with, though we do especially warn our teachers to help students understand something that we call soft core denial. So we find less and less that people are outright saying the Holocaust didn't happen. But what we find more and more are people who were purporting to be authorities saying things that there were no gas chambers used, or the numbers don't match up. Not that many people died, Hitler didn't know. And we see these things show up on social media all the time as well. So looking out for these steps that ultimately do lead to larger denial. And many of them are wrapped up in many cases tied to current political situations in Israel as well. So we try and help people understand how these modern things often have anti-Semitic roots. How can we untangle those and be helpful in those type of situations? One other thing that we've had recently too, and you might think that in terms of these incidents that we see in schools, that it may be mostly related to an older audience. We've seen anti-Semitic hate speech, certainly at the high school levels, but sadly also at the middle school levels as well. Recently, there was a case that involved a pornographic drawing at school that was both anti-Semitic as well as basically it was a sketch of a rape scene. So that was something too that we worked with the school, not only in talking about sensitivities in terms of anti-Semitism, but what else is happening here as well. So sometimes we do see a crossover in different types of aggressions as well. And the best thing that we always recommend is how can we be a resource, keeping in mind all the community resources that you as teachers have at your fingertips, that it doesn't have to be just something within your own districts that you're looking at, but seeing what the community around you can really provide. And I guess at the end, I can take any more specific questions you might have about some of these.
Kelly, thank you. Our last speaker comes to us from the public school setting. Jessica Bassett is a principal currently in Kansas City, Missouri, and is moving to Lawrence High School. Ms. Bassett is a native of Kansas City, Kansas, where she graduated from Sumner Academy of Arts and Science. She received a 4-year scholarship to the University of Kansas, where she majored in vocal performance. During her tenure at KU, she was deemed, quote, one of the top 10 most powerful women on campus because of her leadership in student government and in various social organizations. She began teaching as her teaching career as a music reading teacher in Kansas City, Missouri, at a charter school. She then joined the Kansas City public school system, where she taught at J.A. Rogers and at Westport High School. She became the academic vice principal for East High School, then became the principal at Crispus Attucks Elementary School in the second year of a school improvement process. In the 4 years, they met the criteria for school turnaround. After district downsizing, she became the principal at Northeast Middle School, where her expertise in transformational leadership became important as well. After just 1 year at Northeast, she was asked to take over at the helm of Southeast High School, where she successfully established a positive culture and climate and shown academic growth in her 4 years as principal. At some time, I'd love to have Jessica talk about the, I'm sure, controversial curriculum he implemented there, but that's for another discussion. This fall, Jessica will join Lawrence Public Schools as a newly hired principal of Lawrence High School. And we look forward to having her in the Lawrence community, and I'm thrilled to turn the mic over to you now, Jessica.
Thank you for the introduction. And I have just really enjoyed this time listening to my fellow panelists. And I've if you haven't seen, I'm over here taking notes. I love learning. So that was really exciting. And so much of what was shared actually aligns with what I'd like to bring. And this is a building leader's perspective on hate speech. One of the things that we know that we have walked into a time where many of our students have actually spent more time with their parents than usual. Because so many students are at home, they've heard a lot of things. And because we have lived in this period where certain types of conversations have become no longer taboo, and you have these conversations, not just in the home, you're having those conversations are being held with their friends in the neighborhood. And what happens now, especially when we actually came back from our online learning, many of our students walked into those hybrid classrooms or either full classrooms, and they began saying things that they've heard because it's a part of what has been, pretty much the conversation from the adults that they've been around. And all of a sudden we're in a room with young people who are from all different walks of life. And what you say is no longer accepted, but it's hurtful. And it creates a whole nother type of harm for the entire learning environment. So teachers know right off, we have to figure out what we need to do to deal with this. So I'd like to kind of talk about some of the things that we talked about in our own classrooms, our own building, and just some real practical things to help teachers prepare for it. Because when we come back in full capacity in the fall, we have to be prepared. And one of the mistakes that we make is not having what I say, that good offense to deal with the defense that's coming. So we have to make sure that we're prepared for that. I'm going to share just a little bit of my presentation. Uh-oh. Okay. I probably come in a different way, so I might not be able to share because of my Wi-Fi went out, but let's go ahead and talk. So, every teacher has to be able to wing it. When you have one plan, you got to have a plan B. So here we are with plan B. So I'd like to first start off by establishing just a real common understanding of what hate speech is. Okay, try again. I am trying again. I am sharing. Look at here. This is exciting. All right. So I'd like to begin by just really starting with a common understanding of what hate speech is, because if we don't start off with a really firm foundation of what it is, then it's going to be difficult for us to have these conversations for our students. And I always like to start off, I'm at a high school, so I like to always start off with just the highest level, and then we kind of break it down. But I pulled this definition from the UN Strategy Plan of Action on Hate. This definition really rang, and it was pretty clear in terms of this idea of it's not just the communication through speech, but it's what happens in writing, behaviors, and attacks. And one of the things that I found is if we name it for students and we are very clear about what it is, there is no there's less pushback when it occurs because we've already put it out there before our students. This is what it is. We have already identified it, and it becomes something that not only the person who's given the hate can recognize, but even those who are in the room. A lot of times students hear things and they're uncomfortable and they're unable to really tell why they're uncomfortable. So if we begin to give them the vocabulary and the understanding of what it is, it really begins to ring home when they hear it, and they can respond appropriately because they know exactly what it is. But I didn't want to just stop there. I think every educator has to have this piece there, but we need to bring it down to a classroom piece. What does this really look like in our classroom? And so what I've talked about with many of my colleagues and teachers is that our classroom definition may have to be brought down to its purest form. Any kind of communication, written, speech, behavior, that does not afford others dignity. And we have really talked about this word dignity versus respect, because respect is one of those things that most people, when they hear it, they think about positions. and they think about superiors, and they think about it's something that's earned. But dignity is the purest form because it is this idea that all people have the right to be recognized for their inherent humanity. So it's building a classroom culture where it is unacceptable for us not to see the humanity in each of us. And that's one of the first steps that we have to take during those first couple of days and weeks of the school year, when we begin to set the tone of what has to happen in our classrooms, our hallways, what has to happen when we're in our large spaces, that we have to begin to see the humanity in every person that we meet, and it will cause us to view each other in a way where, if we've heard some things from home that are hate related, it begins to challenge that, because we are challenging you when you come into this space, when you come into the classroom, when you come into the school space. We have to be able to recognize the dignity that everyone deserves, and that has to drive what we do. And so I always say, when we set the tone, our expectations for the year, we have to always start with making sure that our students know that the dignity in every person will be recognized, and then comes the respect. So those are just some real practical things to kind of start with when we begin to look at what happens with hate speech. And then I always say, you got to know why. There's the why. There's a why you teach. There's a why you're in activities and organizations. But why does this speech happen? And I just pulled just a list of some things, but really at the source of it all, and then we have to be really honest, it's about power. It's about being able to say that I have this place of superiority, and you are there. They're often seeking this power because of their own personal weakness. And so whenever you're dealing with someone who is struggling with what they may feel as their own powerlessness, we have to always be careful to make sure that we, as the teacher, continue to see the dignity that they deserve. And we have to see even the person who is speaking the hate as someone that we have to teach and move to another space where they can understand that what they're saying is causing harm, and that harm has to be repaired if we're actually going to function as a community, and as a learning community. We all know that when we look at the hierarchy of needs, Maslow hierarchy of needs, if a student is in the room and they don't feel like they belong, if they don't feel like they are safe, then it limits the learning that can take place. So it becomes imperative as the teacher, building leaders, administrators, that we create a space where students know that they belong, and that hate speech or any type of words and even microaggressions will be addressed, because we have to make sure that everyone feels safe enough to be able to learn, and that it's a place that they belong. And so understanding the why behind the hate speech even helps us as the educator know how to deal with the students that we work with, and begin to see their need and not just what happened or see the action, but we continue to see the person that's connected, and then we know how to teach, how to show them a different way, how to reveal to them even some of the errors that they are making. And those errors may come from home, but a lot of times if we give them another way of thinking, we begin to open up truth to them and facts. I think Rick mentioned it earlier today. There is a misuse of facts, and using facts to try to make a point. We're teaching them the way to think, the way to look at information, the way to be critical about it and to analyze it appropriately to get truth. So these are some of the things that we have to think about as educators: what hate speech is, why it's used, and now this place, what should be our response? And as I mentioned earlier, our best defense is a good offense. So here we go. before you go into the classroom, we all have to address our own biases. We have to begin to be very reflective as a practitioner, because if we're not careful, what we think will interfere with our ability to number one, recognize hate, recognize that it's harmful, recognize that what's being said is it is not good for our learning environment, our community. And so I say that for everyone. And I'm going to kind of just give you a story. I worked at my present school that I'm working at. Not only is it just a comprehensive high school, but we also have a school within a school. It's an African-centered college preparatory academy that works within there. So they teach a lot of African-centered ideas and thoughts. So they follow the code of Ma'at. And so we have been really working to bring in more Black teachers so that they can kind of work with that particular group and that population. But one of the things that we found is that so many, even some of our teachers of color, had their own biases against Black students. And we had to address those things so that we could understand whatever is being said, we have to be able to counteract it, because we have to make sure that we don't believe that about Black students as well. And so we talked about our middle class values. We talked about some of the things that causes us to not, what we say, I don't understand what they're doing. But a lot of times we're not seeking to understand the behaviors. So your best defense is to first check your own bias, check your own thoughts about the people and the students that you work with. And the second thing that I'm going to ask every teacher to do before you go into the classroom, you have to acknowledge that it can and it will happen. I mentioned earlier about students being at home and bringing some of the things that they've heard that were the norm at home that are very inappropriate in especially a educational institution. And so we have to acknowledge that it will happen. And every teacher needs to thirdly create a plan. And I say create a plan simply because when I prepare for the school year, not only do I prepare my lessons in terms of the lesson plan and what objectives I plan on teaching and the activities that I'm going to do. But before the school year begins, I also put together what I want my expectations to be in terms of the classroom management. I began to plan on what transitions look like. I plan about how students should sit in groups, and I have a plan for every piece. But if we're wise, we also need to plan to deal with if hate speech or these microaggressions pop up in our class. What is your plan of response? What are you going to do when it happens? Because you don't want to be taken aback where you're fumbling, you're trying to figure it out. So number one, you have to establish a culture. I apologize. This is of dignity versus respect, not dignity versus dignity, but dignity versus respect. So that's first. We talked about that already. We also have to begin to prepare a plan of what should my response be. And I loved what Dr. Graham mentioned earlier about this idea of pause, taking a breath, grounding yourself before, and then begin to dive in, dissect what was said and why it was said, because those are the things that you have to already be ready to do when the time comes. And this is something that I love doing, and we do it a lot when we're preparing for behavior management. But this is something that we can also do to prepare when we find students who may bring hate speech into the classroom, to act it out as teachers. And it's a process that we call name it, see it, do it. So this hate speech may happen. When you see it, what will your response be, and to do it. And we literally role play teachers' response, and we give our teachers feedback on their responses so that they can be better and prepared to respond to what we may hear. Now, some people say, well, I'm good at this. I know how to do it. Not everyone is really quick enough to do it just by instinct. So if we prepare for it, it's almost like preparing to teach a lesson. You go through your lesson, you teach through it with your imaginary classroom. Where now we're going through, how do I prepare if hate speech was to arise in my classroom? What will be my responses? How will I lead a conversation? Actually having questions in place. And the last thing that I always say is act. The one thing that we shouldn't do is ignore it and not act like it didn't happen. Because if we do, we are affirming the hurt that's in the room. We have to have a time to really deal with the harm that's been caused, so that we can build our classroom spaces to a place where learning can take place. And if we don't deal with it and we accept it, it makes it a space that students are reluctant to be in, a place that they don't feel safe, and a place that will limit the learning that can take place. I'm going to use one simple example. I'm going to use my niece as an example. I had the opportunity to be the one in charge of watching the students doing, my children and my niece doing virtual learning. And in her classroom, there was heated conversation around the N-word and how it was being used. The Black students in the room were very angry and upset. And so one of the students asked the teacher, well, what do you think? And his response was, I'm in a place where I can't tell if it's right or wrong. So I'm just gonna let you all hash it out. And she said, I don't ever want to talk to him again. He doesn't know how it hurt me. And so it became a time where she said, I gotta leave this room. But we don't ever want our classrooms to be like that. So I always say, create a plan, act, because our students need that. Thank you. That's all I have.
And Jessica, that was great. If you can go back to the full screen, we'll get the slides from you and post them on our website. So for everybody, folks, if you have some questions, we have about 15 minutes left. Please go ahead and post them. I've got one for all of you to think about, and it's about the challenge. You know, the Supreme Court handed down a decision just, I think yesterday or today, and it was not a surprise, frankly, about the young girl who did not get onto the cheerleading squad, and she on her social media, she said some less than nice things about the school, and then she was kicked off the softball team, and other things happened, and she went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, in an 8-1 ruling, ruled in favor of the student, that you don't, harkening back to an older court case, you don't shed your rights, your First Amendment rights at the schoolhouse gate. Okay, that's true. But on the other hand, as I indicated earlier, students spend about 7 to 8 hours online outside of school. And the vast majority, I think, nowadays of the bullying and hate speech that takes place with students off campus on social media, that no doubt students walk into school feeling pretty bad about themselves with that. So here's the unanswerable question, I suppose. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with this behavior that's on social media? It's online. If it's Snapchat, it goes away in 60 seconds. And it's taking place off school grounds. You haven't viewed it, but it is affecting young people. You are all, by the way, Shameen taught us that you were all spiritual engineers. So I now certainly believe you can answer this or any other question. So have at it.
Rick, I'll jump in here just because I like high diving boards. I think it's important that, and when that ruling came down, I was really thinking about the K through 12 process and the impact that this will have now on online, the online bullying process that happens when students are at home. And so the concept is, if we're talking about free speech, then this student who is articulating something that's important to them, what medium are they using? Who, right? So what's the connection to the school? That's really the question that I would ask, right? Did they use the school's equipment, right? Did they use the school's, if they use anything connected to the school, then are they still, could they be held accountable because they were still using processes that they went through the school system in order to do this? But if they were on their own phone and they did it on their own social media, it sounds like from the ruling yesterday that we have no right? That principals have no jurisdiction over those students in that space. I think the only thing we can do is what they're doing in Amsterdam, right? Or in some Dutch schools, they're teaching empathy an hour a day in those schools, right? So they're saying we're going to make this a cultural issue where we're going to start at the earliest levels to start teaching empathy all the way through high school. So that's what I say we need to attack it or use a different strategy to address the behavior rather than trying to go from this punitive punishment perspective around these issues.
Anybody else want to jump in?
I'll just say we there seems to be a big shift, especially in urban ed, where we have just really talked about this idea of being punitive and replacing it with restorative justice practices. And this idea of always bringing in whomever was hurt, as well as the person who was perceived that actually brought the harm. And how do we come to a place where we can live and work in a space and try to repair that harm and repair that breach? And it's been through those practices that we've actually had the best change in behavior and in thinking and in actions and attitude. I think it really if a student makes a statement that is harmful to any person in the community, it takes them to a whole nother place when they have to be face to face with whomever they've harmed and begin to hear and see how that harm has damaged or hurt them, and then been given the responsibility to repair it, because we have to be able to work in the community. I think it's through those practices that we may actually get a better result, because they begin to see that the person that's on the other side of that message is human. They have feelings. They have some of the same connections. They walk through the same hallways, and it really does change a person's thinking about other people when they have to be faced with it and then challenged with coming up with their own solution of repairing that relationship.
Anybody else? I will share, there's a couple of questions. I'm going to go through them. I do want to share for all of you that the Supreme Court ruling relied on a famous speech case back from the Vietnam period, Tinker versus Des Moines, Iowa, where the kids wore a black armband to silently protest the war. And the court set a standard, and this court said that standard still holds, whether it's on campus or off campus. If you can show that the speech creates material and substantial disruption in the processes of the school, you can do something about it. In the case of the girl, she just said something like the school sucks. That doesn't affect the operation of the school. But if somebody is affecting children and their ability to learn, one of the questions, we'll get to this in a minute, talked about, it's not just students that post weird things, it's sometimes teachers doing it as well. Let me get to the first question for you all. What are some sample questions to ask when students make inappropriate comments in class? For example, name calling or things like that.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
So some of the questions that we prepare in advance is please clarify why you use those words. And we kind of start with those kind of those questions. What basis or what truth or what fact are you using to say that? And so it's some of those types of questions that makes them think, and especially when you set up a classroom where if you can't prove it, you can't say it. You know, so it's this idea you start kind of asking those questions. Where does it come from? What is it based in? Why would you use it in this space? Why is it appropriate to use in this space? Is it appropriate to use at all? And then it goes back to that question on the wall. Does that statement fall in line with our belief about every human's right to dignity? And so it's those kind of questions that you can ask, especially when you've already established that dignity is like a value for this room, that when you go back and say, does this align with our belief about every person's inherent right to be treated in a dignified manner? And so those may be some questions that you can ask to get to why.
And Jessica, I think it's great that when you work with your teachers, you set a baseline that here's the behaviors these are the behavioral guidelines. Kind of like how many meetings have we all been in where people say everything is confidential here. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, right? And that's in essence what you're doing. You're saying here's the ground rules in the classroom, and that gives you the basis for asking those questions. BA, you deal with this a lot. I don't know if you have any thoughts on the kinds of questions that might be relevant.
Yeah, I really come from this space of nonviolent communication, right? That's really Marshall Rosenberg is the founder of nonviolent communication. At KU, we call it compassionate communication. And so the concept is, how do we connect? Again, if we're holding that person in wrongness or badness, that means they need to be punished for what they've done. So I think about the restorative justice practices, right, that are a part of these processes. And so I always ask the question, help me understand what you're trying to get at when you said what you said, or when you call that person out of their name. What need was not being met for you? Help me understand what feelings are going on for you right now, right? What's alive in you that you would see this person in this particular way, right? So you want to be curious, right? It's you come from a place of curiosity rather than saying you're wrong for saying what you said to start out with, right? My only goal here now is to connect and understand first. That's the first thing I want to do. Then I want to articulate that the strategy you're using to meet your need is not working for us, right? That strategy is not a strategy that we will use. So to Jessica's point that is not the way that we show dignity, right, in these spaces. And so I'm curious as to what's going on inside of you that would cause you to erupt in this particular way.
You know, DA, it's so hard now for, I think, teachers because of the culture is now so there's so much of it. It used to come out of the White House, and now it's on the left and on the right on news channels. I mean, the name calling, the example in Deb Perbeck's question and the like. Shelley, I know you deal with that quite a bit, and I think Changming, you probably do as well in your work. I don't know, any other thoughts to add before we move on? Let me, Gary Bailey shared that it gets really difficult because in the online space, you just don't see students posting things that are inappropriate. Sometimes it's the teachers. The example that Jessica just used was a teacher not responding in an appropriate way. Teachers, of course, from a legal perspective, students are there voluntarily and teachers, believe it or not, are not. So teachers can be handled in ways differently than students can be handled in that space. And it's much like the last question was about coaches. Athletics is a privilege, as you point out, and not a right. And there are coaches. I don't know if any of you have seen that Netflix thing, Last Chance U, where they were all at. It was mostly about football, at the community college level. Although the last one was about basketball with a guy who was quite different, I thought, than the coaches in the prior series. But again, coaches should be held to a higher standard. The problem is that kids are in a power differential and don't want to speak up because of fear that they may not get to play. So it's a very difficult space. I agree with the anonymous commenter there. Do you all have any questions for one another? We just got about 1 or 2 minutes left. Any final statements anybody would like to say?
I'll just say, Cheng-Ming, I really appreciate the educate, protect, help concept that you brought forward. When you're talking about that from that perspective, I think about psychological safety, right? How do we create this psychological safety but I'd like this concept of, so is there a reason that it's in that particular order, educate, protect, and help, rather than protect first, then educate? Or is it help? So, or do they, are they connected, or are they three different areas that we should focus on?
When I did it, I didn't think of a particular order. Part of it, I put education first because we are educators. We're talking about educators. So the order is not as important as really the mindset. It's because I think because the previous question is a good example. When you hear people saying, calling names and saying have hate speeches, we immediately wanted to correct. You know, if we know the goal is eventually educate, then we're going to go a different route. That's exactly what you said. Both Jessica and you talk about, you know, what kind of a productive question you can ask. So show curiosity, show empathy. You know, a lot of kids, I want to believe, this is my biggest belief, and it could be unrealistic for young kids below 12th grade. Everyone is educatable. As even if, you know, they spend a lot of time with the people, you know, like Jessica pointed out, we spend with families. Some of the families, we know that they have their background. Maybe there are some, but I think the youth still, if I don't have that faith, don't have that belief, don't have the assumption, I probably feel defeated already in terms of education. So I believe they are educatable. If that's so, this is most important is our mindset. If I believe our teachers have so many good skills. They know they are learners. They know their children, you know, in the classroom. They know if they organize their thought according to what we want to achieve under these umbrellas, and they are going to be spending less time on something that will frustrate them. You know, for example, Supreme Court, is that correct or wrong? You can have debate. Everybody's going to be frustrated. It's not going to achieve much in the classroom. It's from my point. So if we know the end result we want is achieve people who have a good sense of justice, good sense of, you know, dignity. I like the dignity, respect everybody's dignity in classroom. So let's go about that. You know, even if for Rick's question, I would want to say, you know, what kind of comments people are making, why they're making those comments. I truly believe, regardless of how terrible the comments per se, we can find some goodness underneath their intention we could utilize. Meaning that educatable, there's things we could help them to motivate them to change towards, you know, morality and justice.
So folks, Cheng-Ming, thank you for that. I've got to bring this to an end. We're just at the end of time. You can see in the chat space that if you need a certificate of attendance, there's a form to fill out. We also have a survey we asked to fill out. So when we plan this for future years, your feedback is always helpful to us. If you do want a certificate of completion, again, go to global-academy@ku.edu. And there's also a link to a Google form you can fill out as well. Thank you all for being here. This is a topic we can obviously spend a lot of time on. I think Shelley has probably been teaching courses on this for quite some time on related subjects. Thank you all for your participation. We look forward to following up with each of you. We will be hosting more training and educational kinds of sessions in the future. And Jessica, I can't wait to see you in Lawrence. It's great to meet you. Take care, everybody. Thank you for joining
Thanks so
us.
much, Rick.